December 16th, 1985. New York City, 5:26 p.m. Snow had been falling since noon. Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street was filling up with a dinner crowd, businessmen, couples. The ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday evening in Manhattan. Two men stepped out of a black Lincoln Continental on the corner. They never made it inside. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino Crime Family, the most powerful organized crime figure in America, was shot 6 times in the head and neck before he reached the door. His bodyguard, Thomas Bilate, dropped beside him seconds later. The shooters walked away without running. No panic, no hesitation. This was not a robbery. This was not a rival family. This was an inside job, ordered from within the Gambino family itself, executed with military precision, and blessed by men who understood exactly what they were putting in motion. The man who ordered it was John Gotti. But here is what the newspapers missed entirely. Gotti did not kill Castellano out of ambition alone. He killed him because Castellano had become something far more dangerous than a rival. He had become an obstacle to the drug money, to the street crews, to the empire that men like Gotti had spent their lives building beneath the noses of men like Castellano. This is not simply the story of a coup. This is the story of why the Gambinos needed Gotti to do what they could not afford to do themselves, and what it cost every single one of them. Paul Castellano did not look like a mob boss. He looked like a banker. Tailored suits, a palatial mansion on Staten Island's Tot Hill, a home the press called the White House. He preferred boardrooms to backrooms. He thought of himself as a CEO, not a gangster. When Carlo Gambino, the architect of the modern Gambino Empire, died in 1976, he chose Castellano as successor over men far more battle-tested. The reason was simple. Castellano understood money at a structural level. Unions, construction, meat distribution, the invisible economy beneath New York City's surface. But the streets never respected him. John Gotti was everything Castellano refused to be. Queens born, 6th of 13 children. By the time he was 16, he was running errands for the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street crew feeder system for the Gambino family. He did not read balance sheets. He read men. He understood loyalty through fear, through presence, through the willingness to stand in a room and dominate it without saying a word. Where Castellano insulated himself, Gotti embedded himself. 2 men, same family, completely opposite philosophies of power. Castellano believed organized crime could evolve, become legitimate, corporate, untouchable by federal law. Gotti believed it could only survive by remaining exactly what it was: violent, territorial, and absolute. That philosophical divide was not merely personal. It was a fault line running through the entire Gambino structure, and it would eventually swallow both of them. Gotti's ascent was not accidental. It was methodical. By the mid-1970s, he had become a capo in the Gambino family's Burgun Hunt and Fish Club crew in Ozone Park, Queens. The club was a front, a social hall that smelled of cigarette smoke and espresso, but its real function was command. From that single room, Gotti ran hijackings, gambling operations, and loan sharking networks that fed directly upward into the Gambino hierarchy. He was productive. He was fearless. And crucially, he was loyal to Neil Della Croce. Agnello Della Croce was the Gambino underboss. Old school. Violent when necessary. Deeply respected by the street crews that Castellano quietly disdained. Della Croce served as the human bridge between Castellano's corporate ambitions and the street-level soldiers who actually generated the family's raw power. As long as Della Croce lived, the tension held. Gotti operated beneath his protection. Castellano tolerated Gotti because Della Croce vouched for him. It was a delicate architecture. 3 men holding a structure together through mutual self-interest rather than genuine unity. Then the architecture began to crack. Castellano issued a family-wide prohibition on narcotics trafficking. The official reasoning was pragmatic. Drug convictions carried federal mandatory minimums that could pressure soldiers into cooperation agreements. But the street crews knew the deeper truth. Castellano was not protecting them from prosecution. He was protecting his legitimate business interests from the contamination of visible criminality. The drug money, however, was enormous. Gotti's crews were already embedded in it. The prohibition was not a rule. It was a declaration of war, one Castellano did not yet realize he had already lost. The rule was absolute. Any Gambino soldier caught dealing narcotics would be killed. No trial, no appeal, no exceptions. Castellano issued the order with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his authority was beyond question. He was wrong. Beneath the surface, the family's drug networks had already grown too large, too profitable, and too deeply woven into the daily operations of the street crews to simply dissolve on command. The Gambinos were not the only family wrestling with this contradiction. The Lucchesis, the Bonanos, all of them faced the same internal fracture between leadership's desire for legitimacy and the street's addiction to narcotics revenue. But within the Gambino family, the contradiction was sharpest. Castellano's own son-in-law, Thomas Gambino, moved product. Soldiers Castellano personally promoted were embedded in distribution networks stretching from Queens to New Jersey. The prohibition was selectively enforced at best, and the street crews noticed exactly who faced consequences and who did not. Gotti noticed most of all. 3 of his own men were convicted on drug charges in 1983. Castellano moved to have them sanctioned, potentially killed. To Gotti, this was not discipline. This was Castellano using his own rule as a surgical instrument, cutting away Gotti's power base while protecting those connected to his inner circle. The personal became political. The political became lethal. What had begun as a policy disagreement was now something older and more dangerous, a question of survival. Gotti understood that men who feel expendable eventually stop waiting to be discarded. He began making calls, quietly, carefully, to the right captains, the dissatisfied ones, the ones whose crews ran drugs and whose loyalty to Castellano had grown thin as paper. The coup was not born from ambition alone. It was born from necessity, the oldest justification for violence in the history of organized crime. While Gotti made his calls, the federal government was making its own. 1985 was not an ordinary year for organized crime in America. The FBI's RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, had matured into a precision instrument. Prosecutors no longer needed to prove individual crimes. They needed to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise and a defendant's knowing participation within it. The implications were catastrophic for every family on the eastern seaboard. That same year, the government launched the commission trial, a prosecution so ambitious it targeted the leadership of all 5 New York families simultaneously. Castellano was among the defendants. The charges were not minor. The potential sentences were measured in decades. Castellano's response to legal pressure was to withdraw further. He retreated to Tot Hill. He became consumed with his own trial preparation, his own legal strategy, his own survival. He was simultaneously conducting an affair with his housekeeper, a domestic scandal that further eroded his standing among men who viewed personal discipline as inseparable from organizational authority. The streets interpreted his withdrawal as weakness. The FBI interpreted his vulnerability as opportunity. Wiretaps placed inside Castellano's Staten Island mansion had already captured conversations damaging enough to guarantee conviction. Investigators were also monitoring Gotti's Bergen Club. Both men were under surveillance simultaneously. 2 targets inside the same organization, moving in completely opposite directions. Castellano was retreating toward the courtroom. Gotti was moving toward the street. The federal pressure did not stabilize the Gambino family. It accelerated its internal collapse. When an organization faces external annihilation, it does not always unify. More often, it fractures along every existing fault line, and the Gambinos had more fault lines than most. Castellano's indictment removed the final psychological barrier for Gotti. A boss awaiting trial is a boss distracted. A boss distracted is a boss vulnerable. And within the brutal logic of organized crime, vulnerability is never simply observed. It is exploited. By autumn of 1985, Paul Castellano was effectively alone. Not visibly, not officially. He still commanded the largest organized crime family in the United States on paper. Captains still reported to him. Tribute still flowed upward through the proper channels. The formal architecture of power remained intact, but architecture without foundation is simply decoration. The man who had served as that foundation, Neil Delacroix, was dying. Cancer had reduced the Gambino underboss to a shadow of himself by late 1985. Delacroix was the single figure whose respect crossed both worlds, Castellano's boardroom and Gotti's streets. His presence had suppressed the family's internal tensions through sheer moral authority. His illness removed the last institutional break on what Gotti was planning. Delacroix died on December 2, 1985. Castellano did not attend the wake. That decision, whether born from arrogance, legal caution, or simple indifference, reverberated through every social club, every back room, every crew in the Gambino family. In a culture built entirely on ritual demonstration of respect, absence carried the weight of a declaration. The captains who had remained neutral began making their own calculations. Gotti moved immediately. Within days of Delacroix's death, he convened a series of private meetings with key Gambino capos, Frank de Sicco, Joseph Armand, Robert Di Bernardo. Men with grievances, men with ambitions, men who understood that the coming weeks would determine the family's next decade. He did not ask for permission from the other New York families. That was the most audacious element of the entire conspiracy. Traditionally, the assassination of a sitting boss required approval from the Commission, the governing body of organized crime's major families. Gotti bypassed it entirely, partly from urgency, partly from calculation. He understood that once Castellano was dead and the streets consolidated behind him, no commission ruling could reverse the facts on the ground. Power, in Gotti's philosophy, was never granted. It was seized, and then legitimized by the inability of anyone to take it back. The date was selected. The location was chosen. The shooters were placed. Castellano received a phone call inviting him to a dinner meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. He accepted. December 16, 1985. Manhattan, 5:26 p.m. The snow that had fallen since noon had turned the sidewalks gray and wet. The dinner crowd moved quickly. Heads down, collars raised against the cold. East 46th Street was ordinary in every visible way. It would not remain ordinary. Castellano arrived by black Lincoln Continental. Beside him sat Thomas Bilote, his driver, his bodyguard, his most trusted physical protector. Bilote had recently been elevated to underboss, a promotion that had itself angered numerous senior capos who considered him unqualified, a personal appointment born from favoritism rather than merit. Even Castellano's final loyalties had generated resentment. The car stopped. Both men stepped out. 4 shooters in white trench coats were already positioned on the sidewalk. They had been placed there with surgical precision, angles calculated, sight lines confirmed, exit routes memorized. This was not the impulsive violence of the streets. This was a planned military operation executed in the middle of one of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Castellano took 6 bullets. Bilote took 4. Neither man drew a weapon. Neither man had time. John Gotti watched from a car parked nearby. He needed to see it himself, not from paranoia, but from principle. In his world, a man who ordered death and refused to witness it was a man who did not fully own his decisions. He owned this one completely. The shooters walked south on 2nd Avenue and disappeared into the city's indifferent crowd within minutes. No one pursued them. No witness intervened. New York absorbed the assassination the way it absorbed everything. Briefly, loudly, then not at all. By the time the first police units arrived, the Lincoln was still running. Castellano lay face up on the wet pavement, his tailored suit darkening in the cold. The White House boss, the man who had believed organized crime could be made respectable, corporate, clean, died on a public sidewalk like every street soldier he had spent his career trying to distance himself from. The irony was not subtle. It was the entire point. Gotti was at a Manhattan restaurant by the time the news broke across the city's radio frequencies. He ordered dinner. He ate. When informed that everything had gone as planned, he reportedly said nothing. There was nothing left to say. By December 17th, John Gotti was the most powerful gangster in America. He had not been voted in. He had not been approved by the commission. He had simply made himself impossible to remove. And in the vacuum left by Castellano's blood on a Manhattan sidewalk, the remaining Gambino captains fell in line with the quiet efficiency of men who understood survival mathematics. Frank DeCicco, one of the coup's primary architects, was named underboss. The other New York families registered their displeasure privately and their acceptance publicly. The Genovese family, the most politically sophisticated of the five, was particularly aggrieved. Their boss, Vincent Gigante, had maintained close ties with Castellano. He considered the unsanctioned hit a violation of everything the commission existed to prevent. He would remember. But Gotti's immediate problem was not the other families. It was the FBI. Federal investigators had already been watching. The Sparks assassination, executed on a public street in Midtown Manhattan, was not the act of an organization trying to remain invisible. It was a declaration, and declarations attract consequences. Gotti compounded the exposure through his own nature. Where Castellano had hidden, Gotti performed. He held court outside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, dressed in $1,000 suits, while cameras followed him openly. The press called him the Dapper Don. He did not discourage it. He genuinely believed visibility was its own form of protection. He was catastrophically wrong. The FBI installed surveillance equipment inside the Ravenite itself. The conversations captured within those walls would eventually form the evidentiary foundation of the case that destroyed him. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on 13 counts, including murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. The primary witness against him was his own underboss, Salvatore Gravano, who had stood beside him through the Castellano conspiracy and then traded everything he knew for a reduced sentence. DeCicco never lived to see any of it. A car bomb killed him in April 1986, widely attributed to Gigante's Genovese faction, settling the score for Castellano's unsanctioned murder with a cold patience that distinguished their organization from Gotti's theatrical ambition. The drug prohibition that had ignited the entire conspiracy quietly dissolved under Gotti's leadership. The street crews ran narcotics openly. The federal sentences Castellano had feared materialized exactly as predicted, dismantling crew after crew through cooperation agreements that peeled the family apart from the inside. Everything Castellano warned would happen, happened, simply under different management. Here is what Sparks Steakhouse actually teaches us. Paul Castellano was not killed because he was weak. He was killed because he understood something the streets refused to accept, that the age of the American Mafia was ending, and no amount of violence could reverse that trajectory. His instinct toward legitimacy was correct. His method of imposing it was fatally miscalculated. Gotti was not wrong about power. He was wrong about time. He seized the Gambino family at precisely the moment it could no longer be saved, and mistook the noise of his own coronation for the sound of an empire consolidating. The cameras loved him. The courtroom destroyed him. The underboss he trusted above all others looked federal prosecutors in the eye and spoke his name without hesitation. This is the central truth organized crime repeatedly refuses to learn. The same qualities that build these structures, absolute loyalty enforced through fear, hierarchy maintained through violence, silence purchased through mutual complicity, are identical to the qualities that ultimately collapse them. The system consumes itself because it cannot tolerate the one thing that might sustain it: trust without coercion. Paul Castellano died on a wet Manhattan sidewalk, believing he had built something that could outlast him. John Gotti died in a federal prison medical facility in 2002. The Gambino family fractured beyond recognition, his name reduced to a cautionary footnote in the history of an organization he had once commanded absolutely. The Lincoln Continental was still running when the police arrived. Some engines, once started, cannot be stopped, only abandoned by the side of the road when the fuel finally runs out.